His funeral home smelled like lilies and cold coffee, and I remember thinking, in the strange, detached way grief sometimes lets you think about irrelevant things, that I would never be able to smell lilies again without returning to this exact room. That my son's name was Daniel. He was 7 years old. He had a gap between his front teeth that he was self-conscious about and stopped being self-conscious about the day I told him it made his smile look like sunlight coming through a fence, a strange thing to say to a 7-year-old, but he had repeated it to his teacher, to his cousins, to anyone who would listen, until sunlight through a fence became a small, private phrase between us that meant nothing to anyone else and everything to him. He had been dead for 6 days when we buried him. I want to say that plainly, because everything about that week was built on the specific, unbearable arithmetic of days. 6 days since the accident, 4 days since I had been able to keep food down, 2 days since I had last cried, not because the grief had lessened but because some part of my body had simply run out of whatever crying requires. The accident happened on a Tuesday afternoon. Daniel had been staying with my parents while I finished a late shift at the hospital where I worked as a nurse, an arrangement that had existed for years, ordinary and unremarkable, the kind of help grandparents give without either side thinking twice about it. He had been playing in their backyard, near the pool, while my mother was inside on the phone and my father was in the garage. Nobody saw exactly what happened. What is known is that Daniel went into the water, and that by the time anyone found him, several minutes had already passed, and that those minutes were the ones that mattered more than any of the ones that came after that I was called at work. I remember very little of the drive to the hospital except that I ran a red light and do not remember deciding to do so. That he did not survive. That I am not going to describe what those 6 days between his death and his funeral were like in detail, because I don't think I could, even now, find language equal to them. I will only say that grief of that particular kind, a parent's grief for a child, sudden and preventable feeling even when it technically wasn't anyone's fault, does not behave like other grief. It does not arrive in stages. It arrives all at once and then simply stays, a permanent resident in every room of your life, and you learn, slowly, to exist alongside it rather than through it, because through it turns out not to be available as an option. That why parents were destroyed. I want to say that clearly, at the outset, because everything that follows might make it sound as though I am describing people who didn't love Daniel, and that isn't true. My mother had picked him up from school every Wednesday since kindergarten. My father had taught him to fish, badly, at a lake 2 hours from their house, and Daniel had loved it anyway, loved the badness of it, loved that his grandfather couldn't cast a line properly and laughed about it every single time. They loved him. Their devastation was real, but grief, I would learn in the months that followed, does not always move in the direction of tenderness. Sometimes it moves in the direction of blame, because blame is easier to hold than helplessness, because a story in which someone did something wrong is more bearable, to some minds, than a story in which a child simply died and no one could have stopped it. And why mother needed someone to have done something wrong that I did not understand. Standing at the front of that funeral home in a black dress I had bought 2 days earlier because I owned nothing appropriate for burying a child, that I was about to become that someone. The service was small, closer family, a few of Daniel's classmates with their parents standing awkwardly near the back, his teacher, who cried more openly than almost anyone else in the room. I stood near the casket, which was smaller than any casket should ever have to be, and I do not remember most of what the officiant said, because I was occupied with the specific, consuming effort of remaining upright. That why mother approached me afterward, during the part of the afternoon when people were meant to be offering condolences, standing near the small reception my aunt had organized in the adjoining room. I remember her face before she said anything, a face I had known my entire life, wearing an expression I had never seen it wear, something that had grief in it but also something harder sitting just beneath the grief, waiting. You weren't even there, she said. That I told her I knew that I had been at work, that I was sorry I hadn't been there, a sentence I had already said to myself several thousand times in the preceding 6 days. You're always at work, she said, and her voice was rising now, loud enough that the room, which had been operating in the hushed, careful register that rooms adopt around grief, began to go quiet in the specific way rooms go quiet when they sense something is about to happen. You leave him with us because it's convenient. You never once asked if we could handle him for that long. You just assumed. You always just assume. I said her name, quietly, aware of the room, aware of Daniel's classmates near the back, aware of his teacher who had stopped crying and was now watching us with an expression of dawning alarm that my father joined her. This is the detail I have turned over the most, in the time since, that he did not attempt to de-escalate what my mother was saying, did not put a hand on her arm, did not suggest that this was not the time or the place, but instead stood beside her and, after a moment, began speaking too, adding his own version of the same accusation in the lower, more measured tone that somehow made it worse rather than better. If you had been where you were supposed to be, he said, our grandson would still be alive. I want to describe what that sentence did to me, standing 3 feet from my son's casket, but I don't think I fully can. There is a particular kind of pain that arrives not as an emotion but as a physical event, something that happens in the chest and the throat simultaneously, and that is what happened when my father said those words in a room full of people who had come to mourn a 7-year-old boy and were now watching his mother be accused, by his grandparents, of causing his death. That my mother was not finished. She said more, that I had always put my career first, that I had never been the kind of mother Daniel deserved, that if I had made different choices he would be alive to make his own, and I remember standing there absorbing each sentence with the strange, hollow stillness of someone whose capacity for further devastation has simply been exceeded, who has nothing left to protect themselves with. Nobody in that room defended me. I want to be honest about that, because it is part of what happened and part of what I carried afterward. My aunt looked at the floor. Daniel's teacher put a hand over her mouth. A few of the other parents began quietly gathering their children, the specific motion of people trying to remove young witnesses from an adult catastrophe. My husband, Daniel's father, though we had been divorced for 3 years by then, amicably, without the kind of animosity this story might suggest, was not present. He lived out of state and had flown in for the funeral but had stepped outside minutes earlier, and would tell me later that he heard only the tail end of it and spent the rest of the day wishing he had been in the room, that I did not defend myself either. I understand, now, that this was its own kind of collapse, that the version of me capable of standing in a room and calmly refuting an accusation of responsibility for my own child's death did not exist that day, had not existed since the phone call 6 days earlier, and that what remained of me was simply not equipped for the task. That I left the reception without speaking to anyone else. I drove home, carefully, this time, obeying every light, and I sat in my car in the driveway for 11 minutes before I was able to make myself go inside, because I understood that once I was inside, in the house that still had Daniel's shoes by the door and his drawing taped to the refrigerator, I would have to exist in the specific, doubled grief of missing my son and having just been told, by my own parents, in front of everyone who loved him, that his death was my fault that I did not speak to my mother for the next several weeks. This was not a decision so much as a simple incapacity. I did not have the resources, in the state I was in, to manage a relationship that had just delivered that particular wound on top of the deepest one I had ever carried. What I did not know, in those weeks, sitting alone in a house that had become unbearably quiet, was that a recording existed of a phone call that had taken place the night before Daniel died. A recording my mother did not know I had access to, that captured a conversation between her and a family friend, made almost as an afterthought when her phone had accidentally begun recording during what she believed was an ordinary call. That I would not learn of its existence for another month, and when I did, everything my mother had said to me in that funeral home, every accusation, every certainty, every unbearable sentence delivered over my son's casket, would have to be understood in an entirely different light. That I need to go back further than the funeral, because I don't think what happened afterward makes sense without understanding what my relationship with my mother had actually been like, underneath the surface, for years before Daniel died. That my mother, Linda, had never fully approved of how I lived my life. This is a common enough story, a daughter who chooses a path her mother wouldn't have chosen, a mother who never quite stops registering that difference as a grievance, but in our case it had a specific shape. I had become a nurse instead of the teacher she had hoped I'd be, because teaching was what she had done and what her mother had done before her, and there was a version of our family's future she had been quietly building in her head for years that I had, without ever intending to wound her, declined to live out. Then I had married young, at 23, to a man named Robert, and we had Daniel 2 years later, And for a while that seemed to smooth things over. My mother adored being a grandmother in a way that was uncomplicated and total, and some of her disappointment in me seemed to soften in the presence of her disappointment being irrelevant to how much she loved my son. The divorce, when it came, reopened something in her that I don't think had ever fully closed. Robert and I separated when Daniel was 4, for reasons that had nothing dramatic in them. We had simply grown into two people who loved each other more as friends than as partners, and we had handled it, I still believe, about as gently and cooperatively as a divorce can be handled. But my mother did not experience it that way. She experienced it as further evidence of a pattern she had already decided existed in me: carelessness, a failure to hold on to the things that mattered, an inability to simply do the stable, ordinary thing that I started picking up more shifts at the hospital after the divorce, partly because I now needed the income in a way I hadn't before, and partly, if I'm honest, because work was a place where I felt competent and useful during a period when very little else in my life felt that way. My parents began keeping Daniel more regularly, Wednesdays, some weekends, occasional evenings when a shift ran long, and I want to be clear that I never once heard either of them express reluctance about this arrangement while it was happening. My mother volunteered for it. She would call me, some weeks, to ask if she could take him an extra day, because she loved having him, because he filled something in her house that had gone quiet since I'd moved out years earlier. That I did not know, during any of this, that my mother had begun talking about me differently when I wasn't present. This is the part one only learned about afterward, through the recording, and through conversations that followed it, that my mother had spent much of the 2 years before Daniel's death describing my life, to her closest friend, a woman named Patricia she had known since college, in terms considerably less generous than anything she had ever said to my face. That I was selfish. That I had chosen my career over my family. That she worried, often and specifically, about what she called my priorities, and that she had said, more than once, in ordinary conversations that had nothing to do with any specific incident, some version of the sentence, "Something bad is going to happen because of how much she leaves that boy with other people." That I did not know any of this. I want to underline that, because it matters for what comes next, that the accusation she made at the funeral did not emerge, for her, from nowhere. It had been building, privately, in conversations I wasn't part of, for a long time before Daniel died. Gave it a subject. The call that would eventually become the recording took place on a Monday night, the evening before the accident, though neither my mother nor Patricia had any way of knowing, while they were having it, what the following afternoon would bring them. My mother's phone, an older model that she had never fully learned to use, had a habit of misbehaving in small, ordinary ways, apps opening on their own, the screen recording her pocket's movements as she walked, notifications she didn't understand. On this particular night, a voice memo app that Daniel had, at some point, curiously opened while playing with her phone weeks earlier, began recording partway through her call with Patricia, apparently triggered by an accidental touch, and continued recording for nearly 40 minutes while my mother talked, unaware, with the phone sitting on the kitchen counter beside her. I would not have known this recording existed at all if not for Patricia herself. About 5 weeks after the funeral, Patricia called me. I almost didn't answer. I had been screening most calls during that period, capable of very little beyond the minimum required to keep functioning, but something made me pick up, and I am grateful, now, that I did. She told me she needed to tell me something, and that she had been sitting with the decision of whether to tell me for weeks, unsure if it would help or simply cause more damage to a family that had already been badly damaged. She told me that she had recently gone through old files on her own phone, backing things up before an upgrade, and had found that my mother, who did not know how cloud backups worked and had, apparently, once had her phone linked to Patricia's account during a shared family plan years earlier and never fully unlinked it, had a recording sitting in a shared folder, dated the night before Daniel died. Patricia told me she had listened to it. She told me, her voice unsteady over the phone, that there was something in it I needed to hear, not because it would bring Daniel back, not because it would fix anything that had been broken at that funeral, but because she did not think I should go on believing what my mother had told me in front of everyone, when the truth, spoken privately the night before it mattered most, was different. That I asked her what was on it. She said she didn't want to tell me over the phone. She said she would send me the file, and that I should listen to it when I was ready. and that she was sorry, genuinely, deeply sorry, for whatever part her silence in the week since the funeral might have played in prolonging what I'd been carrying. The file arrived in a text message 20 minutes later. I did not open it that night. I sat with my phone on the kitchen table, the small audio icon visible on the screen, for the better part of an hour, aware that whatever was contained in those 40 minutes was about to become permanent in a way it currently wasn't, that once I knew, I would not be able to unknow it, and that I had already absorbed enough permanent, unbearable knowledge in the previous 6 weeks to last several lifetimes. But I also understood, sitting there, that I could not go on the way I had been going on. Carrying my mother's accusation as though it might be true, turning it over at 3 a.m, building and rebuilding the 6 days before Daniel's death to see if there was some version of them in which she was right and I really had failed him through my own selfishness. That I opened the file that I put in my earbuds, because some part of me already understood that whatever was on this recording was not something I could listen to through a speaker, in a room, without the specific, contained privacy that earbuds provide. That I pressed play. For the first several minutes, it was almost unbearably ordinary, my mother and Patricia discussing a mutual friend's kitchen renovation, a recipe my mother wanted to try, the specific meandering rhythm of a phone call between two women who have known each other for 30 years and no longer need any particular reason to talk. I remember feeling a strange, brief relief listening to it, hearing my mother's voice sound so normal, so unweighted by anything that was about to happen to all of us in the next 18 hours. Then, around the 11-minute mark, Patricia asked her something about Daniel, an ordinary question, how's my grandson doing, that kind of thing, and my mother's voice shifted into a register I recognized immediately, the one she used when she was about to say something she considered important. He's with me tomorrow again, she said. I actually love having him. I was telling Frank last week, I think it's good for him to be here as much as he is. He's calmer here. Settled. I worry sometimes he doesn't get enough of that at home, with everything so unpredictable with her shifts, but that's exactly why I don't mind at all. I'd rather he be here than anywhere else when she can't be there. I stopped the recording. That I sat in my kitchen, in the same house with Daniel's shoes still by the door, and I understood that I had been right to be afraid of what I would hear, though not for any of the reasons I had expected. I want to explain something before I describe the rest of what was on that recording, because the moment I stopped it, in my kitchen, I did not yet understand its full significance. I only understood that the first substantial thing I'd heard contradicted, in a small but real way, the story my mother had told at the funeral, that she had described herself, in that private call, not as a woman managing a reluctant, inconvenient obligation, but as a woman who genuinely wanted Daniel with her, who considered his time in her home a good thing rather than a burden absorbed on my behalf. That alone was not enough to undo what she'd said over his casket. People contradict themselves. A grieving mother can say one thing in private and, weeks later, in the specific devastation of a funeral, reach for something crueler and less accurate, because cruelty and inaccuracy are sometimes what grief reaches for. I understood that. I was prepared, when I pressed play again, for the recording to simply be a complicated, human document, not exoneration, just texture. What came next was not texture. It was the specific, exact origin of what happened to my son. That I pressed play again, and the conversation continued in its ordinary rhythm for another few minutes, Patricia asking about my father, my mother mentioning a doctor's appointment, before Patricia asked a question that I have listened to perhaps 30 times since, trying to hear it exactly as it was intended, trying to be fair to my mother in a way she had not, at the funeral, been fair to me. Is Frank going to be around tomorrow to help watch him? You mentioned he's not great at keeping an eye out when he's got a project going. My mother laughed, a small, familiar laugh I had heard my whole life, the specific sound she made when she was gently teasing my father for a flaw she found more endearing than troubling. He says he will be, she said. But you know how he gets in that garage. I'll probably end up doing most of it myself, like always. It's fine. Daniel's good at entertaining himself in the yard for a while. I'll just have my phone with me. I've been better about it. I used to get caught up on calls and lose track of time, but I've learned my lesson about that. I sat very still that I have played this section of the recording for exactly two people since, a lawyer, whom I consulted not because I intended to pursue anything legal but because I needed, in the immediate aftermath, to understand what I was actually holding, and a grief counselor I began seeing several months later. Both of them, independently, identified the same detail I had identified sitting alone in my kitchen, that the night before my son died, my mother had described, unprompted, a known pattern in herself, getting caught up on phone calls and losing track of time while Daniel was in the yard, and had claimed to Patricia that she had learned her lesson about it. She had not learned her lesson. The call continued for several more minutes, drifting into other subjects, and I did not learn, from the recording itself, the precise details of what happened the following afternoon. The recording ended long before that, was simply a conversation on an ordinary Monday night, never intended to document anything, never intended to be evidence of anything. It was not a confession. My mother did not know, when she made it, that she was describing a habit that would matter, catastrophically, less than 24 hours later, but it was, unmistakably, an account, in her own voice, unrehearsed, spoken to her oldest friend with no audience and nothing to gain by shaping the truth, of exactly the vulnerability that had existed in her supervision of my son. Not carelessness in some monstrous sense. Not malice. Just the specific, human, forgivable and isolation pattern of a woman who sometimes lost track of time on the phone while a child played nearby, who knew this about herself well enough to name it to a friend, and who was with my son, alone, doing exactly this, at the exact hour he went into that pool that I called my aunt first. Not my mother. I was not ready, that night, to speak to my mother directly, and I understood that I needed another adult in the situation to help me figure out what to do with what I now knew and why Aunt listened to the recording in near silence, and when it finished, she was quiet for a long time before she said, "Oh, Linda," in a voice that contained an entire history of knowing her sister, of understanding exactly how someone could believe, with complete sincerity, an accusation against someone else that was in fact a defense against a truth about themselves that I understood, turning it over in the days that followed, what had actually happened at that funeral. My mother was not lying, exactly, when she stood over my son's casket and told me I was responsible. I don't believe she was consciously constructing a false story to protect herself. I believe, instead, that grief and guilt had done something to her that grief and guilt sometimes do, that some part of her knew, immediately and completely, in the hours after Daniel died, that she had been on the phone, that she had lost track of time in exactly the way she had described to Patricia the night before, and that this knowledge was so unbearable that her mind had done what unbearable knowledge sometimes forces a mind to do. It had found somewhere else to put it that I had been there. Somewhere else that it was easier, not consciously chosen, but easier in the deep, involuntary architecture of how guilt protects itself, to believe that I was the reason, that my work schedule and my divorce and my supposed carelessness about my son's care had caused this, than to sit with the fact that she had been 15 feet away, on the phone, doing the exact thing she had told her best friend she'd learned her lesson about, while my son went under the water, that I confronted her 3 days after I received the recording. I asked my aunt to be present, not for confrontation's sake but because I did not trust myself to get through the conversation without either collapsing or saying something I couldn't take back, and I wanted someone else in the room who loved both of us. That I did not play her the recording immediately. I asked her, first, to tell me again what she remembered about that afternoon, where she had been, what she had been doing, whether she'd had her phone with her. She told me, for the first time since it happened, the actual sequence of events. She had been on a call. She did not initially say with whom. She had lost track of the time. She had gone to check on Daniel and he was not where she expected him to be. That I asked her if she remembered a conversation with Patricia the night before, about being better about her phone. That I watched something move across her face, not immediate recognition, but the beginning of it. The specific dawning horror of a person realizing that a truth they have spent weeks successfully keeping from themselves is about to become unavoidable. That I played her the recording. That I will not describe in detail what the next hour looked like, because I don't think it would serve any purpose beyond a kind of cruelty neither of us needs revisited. I will say that my mother did not defend herself. I will say that something in her seemed to break, in that hour, in a way I had never seen before and hope never to see again, not the controlled devastation of the funeral, but something more total, the sound of a person confronting, all at once, both the loss of her grandson and the specific role her own moment of ordinary human distraction had played in it, and the additional, unbearable weight of understanding what she had done to me, in front of everyone, in order to avoid that knowledge. For a little while longer, she asked me, at one point, through tears that had become almost impossible for her to speak through, whether I could ever forgive her. That I did not have an answer for her that day. I still, if I am honest, do not have a complete one. That I want to be careful about how I end this, because I think there is a version of this story that would be satisfying in a way that isn't true to what actually happened, a version where the recording surfaces, the truth comes out, my mother is publicly humiliated the way I was publicly humiliated, and some kind of clean justice is delivered. That is not what I chose, and it is not what happened. That I did not play the recording for anyone beyond my aunt and, eventually, my father, who needed to hear it in order to understand why the story he had believed and repeated at the funeral was not accurate. I did not send it to Patricia's knowledge more widely, did not confront my mother in front of the family the way she had confronted me, did not use what I knew to inflict a symmetrical wound. I thought about it. In the rawest weeks after I first heard it, I thought about it more than I am proud of. But I understood, eventually, that the thing I actually wanted was not revenge against my mother. It was simply to stop carrying an accusation that wasn't true, and why father was harder to reach than my mother, in some ways, because his contribution at the funeral had been quieter but in its own way more damning. He had stood beside her and added his own certainty to hers, without hesitation, without a moment's doubt on my behalf. When I played him the recording, he was silent for a long time, and then he said something I have held on to since: "I should have known you well enough not to need proof." That sentence has mattered to me more than almost anything else that happened in that entire period, because it named the thing that had hurt most about the funeral, not simply that they were wrong, but that they had been so willing to believe it, so quick to reach for blame with my son barely 6 days dead, without extending me the basic faith that 7 years of watching me be his mother should have earned him. Why relationship with my mother is different now than it was before Daniel died, and different again than it was in the funeral's immediate aftermath. We are not estranged. I want to say that clearly, because I know some versions of this story end that way, and ours has not. But something that existed before, an uncomplicated trust, a willingness to extend her the benefit of every doubt, did not fully survive that day, and I don't think it will come back in the same form it had before, regardless of how much time passes. She has said, more than once, that she thinks about that phone call every day, that she does not need me to punish her because she has not stopped punishing herself, and I believe her. I watch her sometimes, at family gatherings, when a phone rings during a moment involving a child, and I see her flinch in a way that tells me the recording did not simply reveal a truth to me, it revealed one to her, permanently, about herself. Daniel has been gone for a little over 2 years now. I still think, more often than I'd like, about sunlight coming through a fence. I think, too, about the specific unfairness of having lost my son and then, in the same unbearable week, having to fight to hold on to the truth of my own motherhood in a room full of people who should have simply known better than to doubt it. That I don't know that there is a clean lesson in any of this. I know that grief makes people reach for blame the way a person reaches for a railing on a dark staircase, not because the railing is the right thing to hold, but because it is there, and the alternative is falling with nothing to hold at all. My mother reached for me. It nearly broke something between us that had been unbroken for 34 years. That I know, too, that the truth doesn't always arrive when you need it most. It arrived for me 5 weeks late, through an old phone backup and a friend who could not carry her silence any longer, and by the time it came, the damage of that funeral had already been done, could not be undone, would live in me regardless of what the recording proved, but it mattered anyway. It mattered that I finally knew, with certainty, that I had not failed my son, that on the last afternoon of his life, I had been exactly where I was supposed to be, doing exactly what I had always done, and that what happened to him was not the story my mother told over his casket, but a smaller, sadder, more human one, about a woman who loved her grandson completely and was, in one ordinary, forgivable moment, not quite paying close enough attention. That I have forgiven her, mostly. I am still working on forgiving myself for the version of that week where I believed, for 5 unbearable weeks, that she might have been right.